Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Butch Hollowell, and I'm proud to serve as General Counsel of the Detroit Branch NAACP. And with that, I bring up our great president of the NAACP, the Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony.
Thank you, Butch. Let me just very briefly say good afternoon and welcome all of you here. I really want to thank Butch for helping to facilitate this forum this morning when we had Stops Cops. It was a tremendous experience in terms of the illustrations between students and police officers and students and officers, real life situations on the street. Many of us have children in our family, teenagers, young people. We ourselves are often on the streets, and some things we just take for granted. We just think we should know, and sometimes we don't think because we're thinking about other things. But that situation made one think, and we really want to take that and move it in a very broader sense. I really, after having looked at it this morning, I was telling the chief and Barbara McQuade, I think it should be mandatory exercise in our schools, particularly when young people are taking driver's training. Before you take driver's training, that should be a part of your course. They may be doing things now, but what I saw this morning really was something that all of us should want our young people to be a part of. I also want to acknowledge Jeff Jarrett, and I wish Jeff would stand. Jeff is a writer, reporter from the Detroit Free Press. I don't have a whole lot for reporters in some cases, but I do think that when they do the right thing and when they are sensitive, and I've seen Jeff over at Mound and Ryan, he is a person that walks the walk and as he writes the words. He wrote a tremendous article on this situation the other day, which I'm sure was read by thousands and thousands of people. I also know that he got a bunch of nasty emails because of what he wrote. And all he wrote was the truth. But this is the climate that we're living in. Even when he takes the time to write the truth, just to inform people, there are a bunch of people that don't want to hear that. Just like this is not a nice conversation, but it's a necessary conversation. And so Jeff, on behalf of the Detroit NAACP and all of the folk who benefit and who need what you write, we just want to say thank you. Let's give him a hand for what he has done and is doing. And again, I want to thank Attorney Melvin Butch Hollowell, the General Counsel for the Detroit Branch NAACP. He's doing a tremendous job for us, and he is an attorney that is worthy of all that comes, because he's not only for the NAACP, but he works with labor and a whole lot of other stuff. Butch is well qualified to be moving in this direction. So I want to thank him, Attorney Butch Hollowell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Anthony. And now, Jeff, why don't you come on up? Jeff Jarrett from the Detroit Free Press is going to moderate this panel, and we couldn't have a better person in that position. He's got a position of real authority over there at the editorial page, and speaks with passion and with intelligence and insight and commitment. And he is inside the walls a lot. You know, when I go and visit, you know, the Ryan prison chapter, you know, for example, over at the NAACP chapter there, you know, he's been there. And when he did an examination up in the Upper Peninsula, he and I were just talking yesterday, and you know, he's walking at the prison there, and nothing but dark faces, the entire prison, and no black guards, none, and raised the issue. I mean, not everybody would raise the issue like that, you know. I mean, you know, Jeff, it raises uncomfortable things sometimes, but you know, honestly, that's what is required when you're in positions of great trust. So we're very honored that Jeff has agreed to moderate this panel today, and I just turn it over to Jeff Jarrett, Detroit Free Press. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Butch and Reverend Anthony. As Reverend Anthony suggested, I wish my bosses at the Free Fest felt the same way about the work that I do as they do. But as Butch suggested, I have been, there's 35 prisons in Michigan. I've been in every one except for one. I've talked to hundreds of inmates. And on a personal note, I have a brother-in-law who's locked up in Ryan, a young man who grew up on the east side of Detroit, whose story is very familiar to a lot of people. So I go in as a visitor as well. I have a personal connection with this. We're here to talk about what I consider to be the most important civil and human rights issue today. And that's why mainstream civil rights organizations have perhaps been a little bit slow to get on this, but the Detroit chapter of the NAACP under Reverend Anthony's issue leadership has always been there. And what I'm so happy about this is it really shows that the largest and oldest civil rights organization in the country is really putting this issue front and center. And that's exactly where it belongs to be. We spend, in Michigan, we spend $2 billion a year on prisons. It's 25% of our general fund, $35,000 a year to lock up each prisoner. We're one of 4 states that spends more on prison than higher education. And nationwide, more than 2 million people locked up, a $65 billion growth industry. And this has, half of them African American, has a tremendous impact on central cities like Detroit of concentrated poverty, where you go into the neighborhoods and you have so many men taken out of the community, so many community structures broken down. 1 out of 14 children, African American children nationwide with a parent incarcerated. In Detroit, when I go into schools and I ask how many of you have had a parent incarcerated, nearly every hand goes up. So in Detroit, the whole problem of mass incarceration is really, really concentrated. And 10,000 people a year get out of prison in Michigan. 95% of those in prison will get out. So they're returning to their communities, and whether they succeed or fail has a great deal to say about public safety in our community as well. So with that, let me introduce, we have a very distinguished panel to talk about this. Is Representative Stallworth here? He apparently didn't make it. Okay, so we have 6 panelists. Let me start with U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade. She has been the U.S. Attorney, the top federal law enforcement officer in Detroit for more than 2 years. She's earned a reputation as a tough and aggressive prosecutor, particularly on issues of public corruption. But she's also someone who's out in the community a lot and takes a broader approach to crime and punishment than most prosecutors do. She was very instrumental in making Detroit one of 6 cities that were recognized for their progress in preventing youth violence. And at that award, she was quoted in the Free Press as saying, "We prosecute violent offenders to remove dangerous people from our community, but long-term solutions to reducing violent crime require thoughtful prevention efforts. We are all here because we know that our young people deserve better." Ladies and gentlemen, U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade. Danielle Smith is a coalition coordinator for the Michigan League for Human Services. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Ms. Smith until today, but I know our organization very well. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan statewide policy and advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring that states' low-income residents achieve economic security. They're very much in the forefront of getting that word out into the media. When you have budget issues under Snyder's budget that affect the poorest people in the state, they're very instrumental in getting the word out. Butch was telling me that she mesmerized him with a budget presentation that broke down the human services and corrections dynamic in the budget. Danielle Smith, ladies and gentlemen. Keith Bennett, I'm proud to say that he's not only a source of mine, but a very, very close friend. He's a program director for Goodwill Industries of Greater Detroit, where he runs the Flip the Script program, which is probably the most successful program in the country, with working with young men and women getting out of prison, or men and women who are on the cusp of getting into the system. And I can tell you that the men and women that work with Keith in the program just love this guy. They respect and love him, and so do I. Keith Bennett. Hiram Jackson, again, a gentleman I just had the pleasure to meet for the first time today. He's CEO of Real Times Media. It's a powerhouse in terms of the African American perspective, probably the leading source in the country for news and entertainment from an African American's perspective. The family of papers owned by real-time medias include, of course, the Michigan Chronicle, the Chicago Defender, the Michigan Front Page, and the Pittsburgh Courier. These newspapers and media outlets are just really instrumental in providing an alternative to papers like the Free Press and getting an African American perspective. And Butch tells me that he also has a personal connection to this issue of crime and incarceration, and he's very interested in talking about the impact of employment of mass incarceration. Ladies and gentlemen, Hiram Jackson. Judge Michael Warren of the Oakland County Circuit Court, another gentleman I haven't had the pleasure to meet until today. He's known as a very tough sentencer in Oakland Circuit, but he's also someone who's had a strong interest in education. He's a trustee of Cornerstone School Association, very involved with charter schools, and also a past member of the State Board of Education. Is that correct, sir? Correct. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Michael Warren. And Keith also tells me that he brought a couple of his participants from the Flip the Script program, Donna Wheeler and Yusuf Farouk. Would you please stand up? And I hope they become one of the things that I just didn't get the panelist list in today, but I think it's so important that we get the input of people who are directly into the system, parolees, ex-prisoners, people I talk to on a daily basis, and Keith works with on a daily basis. Too often in these kind of panels, their voice is left off, so we need to hear that perspective as well. Chief Godbee, also a friend of mine. He's been a 25-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department. He's been our chief for nearly 2 years. He's also a homeboy. He grew up in Detroit near Ryan Correctional in a working-class neighborhood, and he has earned high marks from his fellow officers. He's very popular with the rank and file. He's very popular with the mayor, and he's very popular with the community. One time when I was interviewing him a couple of years ago, he told me every arrest is a failure. Now, how many police chiefs do you hear say something like that? Well, what he meant to say is not that the enforcement side wasn't important. He's very good at the enforcement side, but he went on to say that an efficient and effective police department is one in which we create the environment where crime doesn't happen. To the Chief Ralph Godbee. So, first topic, let's start out with incarceration, mass incarceration, U.S. leading world in the lockup rate. How did we get there? How did we get to become the leading lockup incarcerator in the world? We've had, in the last 4 decades, our incarceration rate has quadrupled, gone up 4 times. And while we had this steep increase in incarceration rates, our crime rates have kind of gone like this, stayed pretty much the same. 4 decades ago, before we started on this sort of insane row, we had pretty much the same crime rate as we do now. So these increase in the incarceration rate has been driven more by policy, public policy, than it has by crime rates. And it's really affected our neighborhoods. As I talked to you before about my brother-in-law growing up on the east side in Detroit, he told me one time that every young man he grew up with, every one of his peers went to prison. He didn't know one person of his peers that didn't go to prison. So it's had a huge impact upon our community where going to prison has almost become a norm. So how did we get there? And more or less, also along with that, has this rise in incarceration rate, what has it done for the chief reason for all of this, public safety? I mean, I think we'd all agree that public safety, keeping our communities safe, is the main reason we have a criminal justice system and a prison system. But has that done that? Has it made us safer, or has it made it less safe by disrupting our communities and making prison sort of a norm experience? And after we go through all these questions, I would hope that we come to some consensus about what we need to do in terms of solutions. I don't want us just to talk about the problems. I want us to talk about solutions as well as the problems. So let me start with Prosecutor Barbara McQuade. If you could tell us how we got to this point, and do you feel that the rise in incarceration has really accomplished its purpose, and that's in terms of making our community safer.
Thank you, Jeff. First, let me say thank you so much for inviting me to participate, Reverend Anthony and Butch Hollowell. What an important topic for us to discuss, and I appreciate your leadership and your vision bringing us here today, as well as you, Jeff, for focusing so much attention on this issue. It is a national tragedy that we incarcerate 2 million people in the United States and that we lead the world in incarceration. And how did we get there? You know, I'm not certain. I have some theories. And one of them, you know, that increase, that spike is a relatively recent phenomenon, as you said, really the last couple of decades when we've seen the incarceration rates really skyrocket. And what has contributed to that? I think one of them is we have become a much less thoughtful society because of the 24/7 news cycle, the way we receive information that has led to this shrill society, and it has led politicians to always have a message on tough on crime. That is always the message. It has led to these mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, you're out. It has led to a culture where unless you're tough on crime, you're not an effective politician. So mandatory minimums is something that we have seen in recent decades. It came about essentially in the 1980s when we saw the war on drugs. And I'm hopeful that that is changing a bit under the current administration. You know, for example, I've been an assistant U.S. attorney since the late 90s, and I saw a change from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration when we had Attorney General Ashcroft and a policy that required prosecutors to charge mandatory minimums whenever they were available. And they were effective based on really only 2 factors about the crime: the quantity of drugs someone possessed and their criminal history. And those are the only 2 factors you were allowed to look at. Attorney General Holder has implemented a different policy which says you can use discretion and look at the unique facts of each case, each offender, and make a thoughtful case-by-case decision. But I think those mandatory minimums is what leads to having so many people in prison. I was visiting, as I frequently do, with some prisoners this week at the Milan Correctional Facility, and you know, asked how many of you, there are 70 men in the room, how many of you are here on a drug offense? And you know, about 90% of the room raised their hand. They're in there for drug offenses. So you know, certainly we need to enforce the law when people commit crimes, especially violent crimes, public safety crimes. There needs to be recourse for deterrence purposes, for public safety purposes. But I think we need a more thoughtful approach because as we see that spike going up, I don't know that we're any safer. As you said, Jeff, we've seen a spike in incarceration rates and some decrease in crime rates, but they are not moving at consistent rates, and so that model is not working.
Well, let me follow up. When you say we need a more thoughtful, smarter approach, what do you have a few recommendations for what policy changes we could make in Michigan that would make our community safer, perhaps at a less costly way of doing it?
Well, you know, I can only speak to the federal system where I work, but in the federal system, you know, for example, the mandatory minimum sentencing laws, the Department of Justice has taken the position that they should be